Hello out there. I can't see you, but I know you're there. And I just wanted to start by thanking and welcoming you to our webinar, How Canada Can Become a Global Battery Powerhouse. I'm Rachel Doran, the Director of Policy and Strategy at Clean Energy Canada, and it's my job today to say a few brief words of introduction and welcome and address a few housekeeping matters to kick off our webinar. Now, Clean Energy Canada is a program of Simon Fraser University's Centre for Dialogue, where we work to accelerate Canada's transition to clean and renewable energy. Now, over the past year, the battery supply chain has become a major topic of conversation right across the globe. Countries have been moving quickly to secure investments along the supply chain, from critical minerals to cell manufacturing to electric vehicle assembly. And North America has been no exception. In Canada, we've seen a number of major battery investments just in the past year, from the Stellantis LG battery plant in Windsor to the GM POSCO cathode plant in Quebec. South of the border, the passage of the US Inflation Reduction Act looks to change the landscape once again. Now, this act brings both opportunities for Canada in the form of consumer incentives for EVs, and also new challenges in the form of manufacturing tax credits that apply exclusively to US investments. Now, in the face of these challenges and opportunities, we've seen a consistent message coming from industry, labor, and academia that in order to compete, Canada needs to start connecting the dots between its investments and be more deliberate and more strategic about how we build out Canada's battery supply chain. Over the course of the next hour and 15 minutes, we're going to look at our opportunity in the context of this massive global competition. Our discussion today builds off of Clean Energy Canada's recent report, Canada's New Economic Engine. This new research, which we co-led with the Trillium Network for Advanced Manufacturing, found that the economic opportunity presented by the battery supply chain is huge. Our report also had some clear findings about where Canada is best positioned to compete and what next steps we should take to capitalize on this opportunity. So, in order to lay out the plan for today, first, Evan Pivnik from Clean Energy Canada will share some of the top-line findings from this report. And then we're going to move into a pointed discussion with our three special guests who are all experts globally in this field. Andrew Miller, COO at Benchmark Mineral Intelligence, Leonardo Paoli, energy analyst with the Energy Technology Policy Division of the International Energy Agency, and Ilka von Dalwigk, a policy manager with InnoEnergy, who also works with the Industrial Development Program of the European Battery Alliance. Following this discussion, we're going to open the floor to questions from all of you. So now, while everyone is getting connected, I'm just going to cover a few pieces of housekeeping. All participants will be muted throughout the webinar. So if you have any technical issues or questions, please ask them through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen. Our communications specialist, Carrie, will do her best to troubleshoot them for you. Now, in order to see the Q&A function, you may need to scroll down to the bottom of your screen or just move your mouse. Also, we would really encourage you to ask questions at any time during the webinar. Please use that same Q&A function at the bottom of the screen that I just mentioned. We're going to be compiling them throughout the webinar and spend the last 20 minutes posing your questions to our panelists. We'd also encourage you to share highlights of the webinar on your favorite social media channel. We will circulate a recording and a copy of the slides to all who registered. Please feel free to share widely. And finally, if you want to stay informed about the opportunity that batteries present, as well as all things clean energy, make sure you sign up to Clean Energy Canada's weekly newsletter, the Clean Energy Review. We'll circulate a link for you to sign up right after the webinar. Now, if you're just joining us, thank you again for participating. I am Rachel Doran, Director of Policy and Strategy at Clean Energy Canada. And now to get to the interesting part of the program, I'm going to turn things over first to Evan, our Program Manager for Clean Energy, for a brief summary of our recent work and latest report.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Just starting us off here. So for the past 2 years, Clean Energy Canada has been working to highlight the significant opportunities that a battery supply chain represents for Canada, and through working with allies across industry, academia, and civil society, trying to identify some of the steps we need to take in order to seize it. So this work really has broken down into two main areas. First is the work captured in our new report that was released in September, Canada's New Economic Engine. This report looked at the potential role that the battery industry supply chain could play in Canada and what we needed to do to secure the opportunity in front of us. It was developed in partnership with the Trillium Network for Advanced Manufacturing and is the culmination of efforts from a number of different organizations who've been working to elevate the profile of this industry. The second piece of work is our convening of the Canadian Battery Task Force, which we co-chair alongside of Accelerate. Through this group, we've been working to support the federal government's efforts to secure battery investments and have worked to highlight the need and the benefits of developing a public-facing battery strategy. Let's start with the new report here. So in late 2021, we partnered with Trillium to quantify the jobs and the economic potential at each stage of this battery supply chain by 2030. We know that Canada has all the ingredients to succeed in the battery space, but that no one had really done the analysis, at least publicly, about how big that opportunity was and where Canada is best placed to compete. So that's what our report does. We quantified the economic opportunities for the Canadian EV battery supply chain and identified the top priorities for the next decade or so. We limited it to 2030 because the battery industry is changing so rapidly, it's hard to know even what battery chemistry will be dominant much beyond 2030, let alone the shape of the industry. Through this work, we took a look at 4 different scenarios, each which represented a greater scale of ambition than the previous one, and where in those spaces we saw the greatest opportunities. And what we found here and laid out in that scenario 4 is that by 2030, we could see the supply chain providing nearly 250,000 direct and indirect jobs and nearly 50 billion in direct and indirect GDP. These aren't automatic though. This isn't the sort of status quo, it's already happening. This is going to require urgent hard work and ambition in order to really achieve that 4th scenario. If you compare it to that first scenario where we really just sort of rest on our laurels and assume it's going to come to us, we see, less than a quarter of that opportunity materialize. The other piece that comes out of our report then is identifying some of the key areas for success in Canada. And they're highlighted here. So number 1 is transitioning our current auto manufacturing to EV assembly. The second one is the opportunity of cell manufacturing and the transformative nature of those investments. And the third one, and perhaps one of the most interesting ones, is this idea of a integrated battery materials space where we leverage our critical minerals and our recycling innovation and focus on actually doing as much of that upgrading here in the country as we can. These areas represented the best opportunity to leverage our competitive advantages that we have today and also saw the greatest potential economic impact. When we looked at this, I think really important to contextualize this with what we've seen. When we started doing our work, our most ambitious scenario is actually closer to our base scenario now, just because of how much success we've seen in landing a number of different investments right across the battery supply chain. And the teams that have been working in NRCan and certainly with Minister Champagne and the ISED team deserve a lot of credit for what we've been able to achieve and what we've really seen invested here. But what we've tried to highlight through our work here is that these investments on their own are incredibly important and huge successes, but are really just the starting point. When we look around the world, we see that a consistent playbook has emerged, that countries that are showing the greatest success in seizing the battery opportunity have put forward both a critical mineral strategy and a battery strategy, and that Canada is actually the only jurisdiction in the world that has serious battery ambitions, but doesn't have a public-facing battery strategy. So this is actually where the Canadian Battery Task Force's work has really taken off. It's been looking not backward, but forward. How do we best leverage the investments that the federal government has been so successful in landing? How do we tie them together and put in place the ecosystem that sees that full battery supply chain here in Canada? The Battery Task Force has brought together experts from right across the battery supply chain, and we've been working to develop consensus recommendations on how we can effectively get that battery supply chain. So through this work, we've identified areas like workforce development, enabling infrastructure, the importance of clean electricity, and putting an emphasis on those areas of the battery supply chain and these supporting efforts and how we bring those together. By identifying which opportunities Canada should seize and also indicating where we should not seek to compete, we can make sure that despite being a smaller jurisdiction with less resources than, let's say, the United States, all levels of government and private sector are working together to seize strategic and specific opportunities. Task Force has tried to get a head start with this work, and they've developed a blueprint of what that public-facing battery plan, that blueprint, could look like. So this will have been a very quick overview of a very large topic, but wanting to make sure there's as much time as possible to actually hear from the other experts around, what their views are on the opportunity for Canada, how we best seize it, and what we can learn from what other countries are doing. So with that, I'll turn it over to Maren Smith, our Chief Innovation Officer at Clean Energy Canada, to kick off the panel.
Great, thanks, Evan. So now it's time to explore some of these topics further with some of the experts we've got with us here today. We're joined today by Andrew Miller, the COO at Benchmark Mineral Intelligence, and Leonardo Paoli, the energy analyst with the Energy Technology Policy Division of the IEA, and Ilka von Dalwigk, a policy manager with InnoEnergy, and who works with the Industrial Development Program of the European Battery Alliance. So welcome all of you, really great to have you with us here today. I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and also just reminding people, if you've got questions, feel free to post them into the Q&A as we go along, and we'll get to them after I get to ask a few questions here. So my first question is for Andrew and Leonardo, and I'm wondering from each of your perspectives, how do you evaluate Canada's battery opportunity? Where do you think the greatest opportunities are for Canada, and what do we need to do to seize them? Why don't we start with you, Andrew?
Sure, thanks very much, Maren, and thanks to you and all the team for inviting me on today. I think the name of the report, a new economic engine, is really, is a really brilliant title, because it does sum up the scale of the opportunity that the battery supply chain presents to Canada in particular. I think, our work at Benchmark stretches the full spectrum of the supply chain, but where we see the biggest opportunities and where we see the biggest amount of development and investment that's going to be needed is in the upstream steps in the supply chain. We've seen the multi-billions of dollars be committed at the automotive levels, the policy momentum going in downstream. Now the biggest question is, can the industry meet that upstream? And the capability of the industry is really limited, one, by geology. Not all countries have economic assets for some of these key battery raw material inputs. Canada, which does, has the added benefit that it's a mining friendly jurisdiction. And I think when you look at the prospects for some other areas of the world that may have shifted away from mining, that may not have the infrastructure in place to support a massive development in its mining sector, I think it really isolates, a very few countries actually that have that infrastructure in place and have the geological capabilities to really meet some of this demand. So I think it's a massive opportunity, and it's something that I think that Canada should be working towards capturing as much of that as possible, particularly as you see some of the developments, south of the border and in Europe. So yeah, massive opportunity from my perspective.
Great, thanks. How about you, Leonardo?
Yeah, absolutely. So of course, I completely agree with Andrew's comments, and something that I sort of in a way in which I like to think about when assessing the opportunity for the battery industry is to think about three elements of it. One requires to have a demand for the automotive sector to be close by, and Canada has that, as well as a production footprint. So both in domestic and being part of the broader North American sort of free trade group. It is there, and then there is technology. So this is Canada is a high-tech country that can also innovate, and so there's no need to just rely on old technologies, but Canada has really the potential to just go the next step. And this is in terms of sustainability, for example. So making sure that what is produced in Canada could be sustainable and therefore gain an edge with respect to maybe other potential producers. And then the third element is what I think Andrew highlighted, is this, in a way, the lack of having the natural resources. It is one of the few OECD countries that has a large automotive industry, sort of stringent regulations that are good for ESG purposes, and is sort of blessed with the natural resources that are needed. So yes, I think it sits in a unique position in the global arena, and it is really important for this opportunity to be seized, not just for Canada actually, but for the broader global community, really.
Yeah, well, that's great to hear. We also believe that. And so I think that's a great segue to you, Ilka. Can you tell us the approach that the EU took? How did you develop the battery strategy? What was the role that the European Battery Alliance played? And, you know, from your experience doing this, what are the lessons for Canada?
Not sure that I can give you any lessons having those both very good reports, but I think when we started the work with the Battery Alliance, a question for Europe was it was still the battery industry at an infancy, and we saw this concern on how Europe could keep its automotive industry in Europe. I think the question was very much related to jobs and employment issues to start with. And when we launched the Battery Alliance back in 2017, it was a question of catching up to Asia. Really, and what we done from the very start was really engaging the entire value chain perspective. So it was not only about the technology development itself, it was really bringing the ecosystem together. And I think this holistic approach is something that might be a good lessons learned for those industrial alliances that we now see popping up everywhere in Europe, but also in the US and in Canada. It is really not a question for either the mining industry or the offtake segments. It's really talking together and develop strategic relationships. And we started this work out in Europe, of course, but I see also the importance of keeping a door open to other countries where we see a lot of similarities and build on those strategic relationships. And that is maybe a lesson learned looking on the recent development going on globally, that we cannot do this on our own. The IRA is it's an important piece of regulation that affects and will affect Europe as well, and taking this into perspective as well, I think it's even more important to keep communication exchange, both skills wise and industrial alliances alive in the years to come as well.
Great, thanks, Ilka. So the next question, I just want to throw it out to all of you. It's come up about other countries, and in particular here in Canada, we're talking about the Inflation Reduction Act a lot. And in particular with that, the creation of the new manufacturing tax credits. It's really changed the battery picture here in North America. What do you think? What are the main impacts that will need to be addressed in Canada with respect to the IRA? Maybe we'll start with you, Leonardo.
Yeah, so of course, let's start. The IRA has an impact on the expected size of the electric vehicle market in North America, especially in the United States, because it is something that adds demand in a way for batteries. So that is one aspect. So this means that the overall envelope of the market has increased thanks to this act. So that is impact number one for everybody. Then impact number two, I think, is the fact that Canada is part of a free trade agreement with the United States, and therefore can be part of this of this expansion that is going to go on. Of course, there are some of the constraints in there that are purely national, purely selective to the United States. However, Canada can be part of the supply chain. So definitely it is involved in the growth that is ahead. But I wanted to sort of to me, there's one thing that is quite interesting about the IRA is that it has a duration of roughly 10 years, right? This is sort of the end date for it. And when one thinks about the automotive industry under the let's say the reshoring of the industrialization of the automotive industry, or even the battery industry, 10 years is a fairly reasonable amount of time for this development to happen. When we're thinking about mining, it feels more like a 100-meter sprint. So if sort of what can Canada do is really, I think, play on this aspect, making sure that it can bring online demand for the minerals that are required in a time that is as fast as possible. Of course, keeping and with a very important environmental regulation being respected. But that, I think, is really the challenge for Canada to take as big of a piece of this increasingly large pie that has come because of the IRA.
Great, thanks. How about you, Ilka?
I can only agree with Leonardo. I think there are both opportunities as well as I think from a European perspective, more what we see the effects right now, I think, is that there are companies that are based in both US and Europe might turn to a scale up earlier in the US in order to capture the opportunities that arose through the IRA, and also given it's only 10 years, it's a fast developing industry. I think that we might see like this move towards the US, an increase of the US market more rapidly than previously. But it is an overall extension of the market, of course, and I agree. I think it will be for the benefit of the entire battery industry if you can bring your resources online as soon as possible. We already touched upon it by Andrew as well. Your jurisdiction in Europe, it is still problematic and very tedious to bring mines online. So there is, of course, permitting playing a big role. Europe tries to mitigate this through a Critical Raw Materials Act that is in the making. But this, is, of course, will take some time. So I think for Canada's perspective, as well for its connections to both Europe and the US, you have a very golden spot of opportunity.
Great. And Andrew, you're in the US right now. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I completely agree with Leonardo and Ilka. I think it's, fundamentally, the IRA is probably the biggest bit of policy to impact the battery supply chain outside of China that we've seen today. It's massive, and I think the ripple effects are going to take a long time to play out in terms of what it does to, in particular, what I'm interested in is what it does to the sort of global shape of trade. I think if you look at some of the supply chain components of that and how it changes the economics for producing and directing some of these raw materials, not just within the US, but obviously from free trade agreement countries, I think it almost poses bigger questions as to what does the rest of the world do? Because when you talk about, that if you start isolating pockets of this supply in various parts of the supply chain towards the US, Europe has a massive automotive industry that's very geared towards electrification, and as Ilka pointed out, doesn't necessarily have the most the biggest mining infrastructure in place to support that. How those partnerships and strategic alliances really develop to force material to other parts of the world and make sure that when not everything is headed towards the US, I think is going to be a major question. But the bigger picture of this is that it's a fantastic step in the right direction, right? I think I completely agree with Leonardo's point about what can be done from a supply chain perspective in a relatively short amount of time is the bigger questions coming out of this. You can't move that footprint of mining in a short time frame. But it gives you a trajectory, it gives companies something to work towards, and I think it gives a signal to the markets that we need to start funding certain upstream projects in certain parts of the world that will feed into that. So yeah, overall, I think it's a positive thing. I think some of the practicalities and what can be done in the short term are a bigger question mark, but it's going to definitely impact the global shape of the battery supply chain.
Yeah, definitely an exciting point in time for batteries. So back to Canada, it's always all about us. As you can see, Evan outlined that a group of companies came together along the supply chain, the Canadian Battery Task Force, and their ask to government is to develop a public-facing strategy that would really guide investments and send signals to the market. From each of your perspectives, as global competition is really heating up here, how important do you think it is for jurisdictions to develop a public-facing battery strategy to guide their work? Maybe I'll start this off with you, Ilka, and then come round to Andrew and Leonardo.
I can be very, very quick and say it's fundamental. I think to elaborate a little bit on this point, I think it's, I mean, in all the sectors, it's very capital intensive, and investments are needed, especially in the upstream part. And those public facing or forward facing public strategies really gives a sense of certainties for the industry as well as to the investors to really take this risk and invest in both cell manufacturing, but also what we see now going all the way to processing and hopefully to mining projects. In many cases, I would say the public side has played a crucial role, also giving this certainty to financial investors to really take this risk and say, okay, we see that a lot of policies is driving towards electrification. They see the demand building up. In Europe, we have a lot of alignment with under the EU Green Deal that all drives towards the electrification of the transport sectors that really fills the demand side. What we need to do now is really do a similar push on the raw material side, where we still see that some of the public investors shy away from mining projects because they consider this permitting hurdle still too high a risk. So money, I think, in many cases is available, but it will go to easier projects like tech or something that is not as conflicted with public acceptance or ESG risk as mining in Europe.
Great, thanks. We may be quoting you on that. Andrew, what are your thoughts? Should Canada develop a public-facing battery strategy? Is that a key to success?
Yeah, I really think it is. I think when you talk about some of that finance that Ilka mentioned that's going to be required, you have seen the hundreds of billions that are now gone into the downstream of the supply chain and going into the downstream of the supply chain. That now needs to be matched upstream. And what a lot of people, on a slight tangent, what a lot of people discount in that equation of how much is going to need to go into these markets is the amount of misallocated capital that goes into developing some of these assets, going into the right types of projects, whether it be from a jurisdiction point of view, whether it be from technology, a range of different factors. But I think if you have those positive signals, certainly from a policy point of view, that you're going to have the backing and the support for development of these industries, it hopefully means that a lot more of that money finds its way to the right places. We are up against a timeline now, so the more of it that goes to waste or goes into projects that aren't feasible or aren't going to happen is to the detriment of the whole market. So I think it's very positive. And just to take a complete contrast, I think, if you look at what's been put out there from some governments, if you look in Mexico, you look at Chile more recently, in terms of some of the discussion around nationalizing some of its resources, it has such a polarizing effect for that financial community and in directing the amount of capital that's needed into what are some really good assets in those parts of the world. And unfortunately, they're not going to be developed, they're not going to expand at the rate needed by the industry, because you have those negative signals. So I definitely think the more positive signals you can send from a government standpoint, the better.
Great, thanks. Leonardo.
Yes, I mean, of course, I completely agree with all the statements so far, and just to add sort of a sense, an idea of the scale is that we're actually running the numbers now to try to estimate how much of this investment would be needed to say at a global level to be in line with the IEA's projections, sort of to be on a net zero by 2050 pathway, and the numbers are really staggering. So we've not finished this yet, but really, even these billions that we're looking at now, we need so much more for climate ambition. So this is at a global level, but we all need to make our part. And if Canada, and again, the importance of it that I see when we look at this again from a global perspective is that Canada really has all of these elements that can make it a special player in the development of this supply chain. And so having a public facing strategy, having a clear pathway for development for a country that is so well placed, again, can only be positive for the whole industry and for the overall energy transition. So
thanks. So there's been a lot of talk about our mineral resources, and we definitely get the sense that the world wants them so that they can build batteries. But we're working to take steps that we don't just export those, that we're actually developing our whole battery supply chain here in Canada. Are there any lessons that you think Canada could learn from the work that you're doing in these other jurisdictions, how we can better secure more of the supply chain here? Maybe I'll start with you, Andrew.
Sure, I'm going to state the obvious, but I think it's really honing on what you do well, on where you have a competitive advantage. And I think we can talk about the geological advantages of some of the assets in Canada, but that doesn't mean that Canada necessarily, from a raw material perspective, has everything you need for batteries, right? It's not going to be competitive across everything. And I think where you choose to position yourself along this supply chain is going to be very interesting to watch, but is also going to be very important in terms of capturing as much of that opportunity as possible. You do have steps in this supply chain that, because of economics, because of logistics, because of the practicalities of putting some of these batteries into applications, that perhaps it doesn't make a lot of sense to be producing a battery cell, for example, in Canada to support multiple different industries, to be exporting to multiple different markets. I think where the biggest opportunity it strikes me is leveraging the technology, leveraging the mining infrastructure that you have, and going, where can we be competitive from a supply chain perspective? Where can we build out some new technologies that are being developed to extract these raw materials that are going to be required in a sustainable way, in the way that the industry needs, and leverage that, our capabilities there. It's not to say that Canada won't have opportunities to move down the supply chain and capture more value, but I think you really have to look at, if we look at it in the most simplistic terms, where is the biggest growth market for batteries in the next decade? It is going to be in the EV market, and there is automotive production in Canada, but if you're producing cells, you more typically want to do that closer to where the cars are being produced. So yeah, just over the border isn't far to go. So it's not saying that you can't do cells in Canada, but I think there's a lot more opportunity upstream from my perspective in terms of extraction and processing of those raw materials for the battery supply chain.
Thanks. How about you, Ilka? Anything?
Yeah, I just adding on it that on Andrew's observations, and I think he is very correct in his observation also. But looking at the two largest demand markets, where we have Europe that is already good on its way, our US is still growing. Maybe do not sell your material cheap, in a way of make use of some of the good things that you have, and that is your high sustainability standards. And I think what we haven't touched upon is this piece of regulation that was put forward or proposed by the European Commission, the battery regulation. It is hopefully to be adopted by the end of this year. They're in the final trilogue discussions right now. I think it was one of them was yesterday or today even. And even though it is not adopted yet, I think it created a lot of commotions throughout the global battery ecosystem when it looked at CO2 footprints on due diligence for its raw materials, really. And I think there Canada, with its hydropower in the system, can really match Europe's demand for batteries and minerals that are produced in a sustainable way. I know that US right now, it does not have a matching piece of regulation, at least not on a federal level. But I think it is a good way to raise the ambition level globally, and saying we produce sustainable produced metals that are produced with a low CO2 footprint, and kind of remind why we are going through this transition, this energy or green transition, whatever you want to call it. It is really to reduce our dependency from the fossil fuels into something that we think is cleaner, better for the environment. And we sometimes say we cannot do this transition if we drive in a clean car with a dirty battery. And I think especially their materials from Canada will be needed to actually make this also a clean way of a clean battery inside our new EVs.
Great. Well, that brings up another point. But before I go there, I just want to remind people, if you've got questions, we're going to get to questions very soon. So if you've got questions, put them in the Q&A. You hover your finger at the bottom and a little Q&A thing pops up. So Leonardo, I'm going to go to you with this one, and then others can chime in. But excuse me. Most of the battery-related announcements that we've seen here in Canada have referenced the fact that we have a reliable source of clean electricity to power the supply chain. So how heavily does the availability of clean electricity weigh in on the decisions that we see companies making when they're considering investments and where they're going to invest and put their manufacturing or parts of the battery supply chain?
Absolutely. Clean electricity is fundamental, as it is it is the main energy input that goes into cell manufacturing, but as well as most of the processing of the raw materials. It's really all about electricity, and it being clean, of course, is necessary for then the life cycle emissions of the battery. As Ilka was saying, in Europe, we are going to probably have soon a standard that is based on such a metric, meaning that having this clean electricity would put batteries made in Canada at a competitive advantage compared to others. So it is definitely really important. I'm thinking also of another example within Europe. For example, some of the countries that have attracted most battery investments are Northern European countries that have famously available large amounts of clean electricity. So if one can draw a parallel there, we see that definitely this is something that plays a role. Not just about it being clean, but also it being cheap, of course, is quite important, as it is not probably the first, but a significant factor of production in here. I just wanted to add another sort of small element, that is this availability of cheap electricity is important for the batteries, but nearly more importantly for the processing of the minerals. This is a very energy intensive activity. We've seen in Europe with the energy crisis, some smelters having to close because the energy prices meant they couldn't operate anymore. So really having large renewable energy resources, well-functioning electrical grid and stable prices is a very strong advantage that Canada has compared to many other regions in the world. And yeah, that's all.
Yeah, very good points. Andrew, anything to add?
Yeah, I'd also just linking it back to what we said about the opportunity. I think that really is a key opportunity that that Canada has, particularly if you talk about, we all know how much of this supply chain today China really controls. But what you are seeing even within China is that as they start to serve the global community, the requirement of the Chinese industry to show its sustainability credentials or the footprint of its manufacturing is seeing a huge shift even internally. If you look at the anode market, you've seen a huge shift towards anode production from its established bases in parts of Inner Mongolia, Heilongjiang, to Sichuan, where they can get more renewable energy. So it shows you, I think, when you talk about the opportunity and maybe catching up some of the areas of the world that are very dominant in this supply chain today, I definitely think clean energy and demonstrating sustainable production of these raw materials is going to be really central to that. So yeah, a massive added bonus, I think, for some of the prospects in Canada.
Great. Ilka, any last thoughts there?
Not at well. I think a lot has been said. I think another opportunity is, of course, adding value to the Canadian industry as part of the processing, as Leonardo pointed out. Very energy intensive, but it also will help reduce transport of material around the globe. I mean, the more processing steps you do close to the source, the less material you need to transport, and thereby also lowering CO2 footprint, which is a good thing. Another positive effect, I think, stemming from the battery regulation is that they really look at this from a life cycle approach. So it's really looking all the way to where the materials come from. And as a company, you have to have follow this due diligence that you really can prove the traceability of the materials all the way from the source into the battery. And I think that Canada is already quite well equipped to really show how the material is sourced and fulfill a lot of the ESG criteria. So I think all in all, there's a good opportunity to capture quite a bit of the value in the processing industry already in Canada. And I think BASF location in Canada is just one of the first steps that you will see in the future. Great.
Well, this has been wonderful to talk with people around the world who are thinking about sustainable battery production, and great to hear your thoughts about Canada. We do have a bunch of questions that have come from the audience, so I'd like to invite Evan to come back in case there's questions that are more about the report and Canada specific. And so the first question we've got is that, Leonardo, you had mentioned that Canada's stringent environmental regulations contribute to ESG. And I'm just wondering, the questioner is wondering, can the panel expand on the role of ESG in the global battery market and how Canada may have advantages or risks? So we talked a bit about the electricity just now, but there may be other things you want to add on the opportunities or risks around ESG for Canada.
I can add sort of something that is, I think, quite key is the traceability. So when there are especially automotive, or in any case, highly public-facing consumers that are placing big orders on batteries, they are interested to know where the minerals that end up in their cars are coming from. So having, again, a well-structured jurisdiction such as the Canadian one, one that is high-tech, can be traceable, places sort of lowers the ESG risks for the OEMs because they know that the materials are coming from Canada. Consumers trust that the Canadian mining industry will respect environmental legislation and social rights. So, so this is what I mean in terms of the opportunity there, is that Canada is a source of raw materials that are trusted by the consumers, and that can therefore have, that's what I mean, the competitive advantage compared to some other regions.
Great. Ilka, anything to add?
I think on this respect, I think we touched upon it. It's about, I think, a good opportunity on the innovations in mining to also electrify mines and prove that you are able to source this minerals and metals in a sustainable way. I think there's also a part of technology innovation here that Canada can start to build on. and in many cases, I think, become a technology leader globally and export some of those technologies then to other countries. I think there is like a spin-off effect on for the mining industry as well. Looking at Europe, those ESG factors will become more and more important, and once a battery regulation will come into place, it will be mandatory to fulfill and be able to show that all the criteria are fulfilled. I completely agree with Leonardo. Canada is a good place to source materials from if you want to know your ESG credentials are actually fulfilled and qualified.
Okay, Andrew, maybe we'll start with you on this next one. With China being such a dominant player, should other countries seek cooperation with China, or should they seek a path independent of China?
I think you need to accept that sort of some of the geopolitical risks that comes with basing too much of your supply chain in China. We have to accept that that is where the vast majority of this supply chain is located today, but that doesn't mean we can't work to diversify to other parts of the world. You know, I think I've been saying for a while that when you talk to other countries, you know, China's obviously often seen as this adversary in your quest for developing a battery supply chain. And I think, you know, it might be a bit more of a useful approach is to actually view what China's done as a bit of a blueprint for how we diversify this, how we move this around the world. People often assume that China has it all on their doorstep and it's just sort of been there ready. It's not the case. It's just China started a lot earlier than the rest of the world, right? And what it's done incredibly well is, you know, it's not that, certainly actually, if you look at the most critical of these raw materials, it doesn't necessarily have very good resources. The geology of it, a lot of it's, you know, it's not dominant in lithium or cobalt in particular, you know, a bit on the nickel side, you can say, with the development of HPAL, but it's not really necessarily from the extraction step in the supply chain particularly dominant. But what it's done incredibly well is the areas where it's not dominant, it's invested very strategically, very quickly and effectively to lock in those supply chains and also develop the processing routes that dictate that some of that raw material has to go to China to enter the battery supply chain. So I think it's, like I say, I think it's definitely a blueprint that can in various ways be used in Canada, in the US, in other parts of the world to really accelerate some of those efforts. And I don't think we can necessarily see China as the country that you have to avoid, because if we take that approach, then the reality is we won't hit a lot of these targets for electrification in the short term. The long term, we can build foundations which maybe mean that we can shift a bit further away, but in the short term, China is central to pretty much every aspect of the supply chain.
Yeah, Leonardo, do you have anything to comment on that?
I think that, of course, international cooperation is always better than no international cooperation. So if there are aspects where cooperation with China can be extremely useful, we're seeing this happening in Europe, in some instances, with some investments from major Chinese players being made in Europe. China is no longer just a maker of batteries; it is also an innovator. Some key new chemistries are being developed nearly only there. So shutting the door is, of course, it definitely would pose, you know, it wouldn't be ideal for our global targets. At the same time, having a single country accounting for nearly the totality of a supply chain is not ideal either. So I think something in the middle is the way to go. Having cooperation without total domination by a single entity, I think, is something that could benefit sort of all of us.
Great. Yeah, I think that's great advice, is look at them as a blueprint and learn from them. China, they're definitely the big actor, and there's probably a lot to learn. So here's a different question. Maybe we'll start with you on this one, Ilka. What actions have other jurisdictions taken in relation to expediting permitting for mining? And one of you mentioned that this is 10 years is a very short time in getting mines off the ground. Can Canada move more quickly? What's your advice to maintaining that sustainability and moving mining more quickly? Do you have any experience from somewhere else? I throw it to you, Ilka, but if anyone else has an answer, I'll be keen to hear it as well.
My main experience comes, of course, from Europe, where we are currently struggling with getting permits for mining, public acceptance. Mining industry has, in many parts of Europe, been very absent from public perception, I think. Despite having a thriving mining industry that built a lot of the industrial success of Europe, a lot of the material in the recent years has been imported to Europe. So when we now start to develop new mines, often greenfield in new locations where people feel it as an intrusion, it's very problematic to have this communication and understanding from the public that actually we need those metals and minerals for the green transition, and have a dialogue with them on how to develop mining industry. It is for the moment very polemic discussions going on, where there is where there are two worlds apart, with very little dialogue in between, unfortunately. So there are some mining projects that got permits. Maybe they have managed the dialogue with local peoples living there in a better way. There are some good examples from Poland. There was a mine that got its permit in a very good way, but I think in many cases we're looking actually to Canada, that we see has a more mining friendly jurisdiction than Europe as a better example. And I think also the involvement of the indigenous people, I think in Canada, where you have a more standardized way of working with them, might actually be a role model for Europe rather than the other way around. But of course, if there's other countries globally that might lead to better, you could say, role models, I'm happy to learn from them.
Well, that's a great segue to another question that's come in, and maybe I'll start with Evan on this one, which is about Indigenous land rights. And how do they factor into this opportunity, mining and the battery supply chain? How can we ensure that Indigenous peoples in Canada are included in and benefit from the development of the value chain in Canada? Evan, do you want to take a crack at this one?
Yeah, for sure. I think I'm really glad this question came up because I think it's really essential for Canada to take this head on and make this sort of something it starts with when it thinks about this. Because Ilka's highlighted just how much deploying infrastructure, deploying mines, building things is going to be such a key part of the energy transition writ large, but also, battery industry. And in Canada, that necessarily means engagement with First Nations. We do see in Canada opportunities right across the country. So there's going to be countless different First Nations, whether it's in, Ring of Fire, whether it's in British Columbia, in Quebec. You've got so many different nations here. And it kind of, for me, the starting point kind of goes back to what the others were talking about with ESG. And I think there's an opportunity for Canada to actually add a letter to that, which is an IESG, Indigenous, Environmental, Social, and Governance. And that part of how we think about the battery brand and what it means to develop resources, whether it's battery materials, the mining, all the way down through cell and EV, that the engagement of partnership with ownership by First Nations is actually something we measure and we prioritize within this. I think on a resourcing side, that means governments, even more than industry, have to be proactive where there's projects. It kind of goes to having a strategy, knowing where you want to be building, what the priority projects are, and then being proactive and engaging First Nations right from the very start in those projects, seeking out those opportunities, but also resourcing them adequately so that they have the capacity to come to the table. I think that's often the step that's missed in Canada, that there's big complex projects that want to move fast, and you've got a First Nation that is often under-resourced to actually sit at that table adequately and look at and engage in what are their interests? What are their community members saying? How do they want to look at this opportunity? So I think that's sort of the full spectrum of how Canada should, but agree with Ilka that it's sort of something that Canada should prioritize and try to be a leader in how we approach it, and hopefully something we can be exporting to the rest of the world.
Thanks, Evan. I'm going to keep us moving along to try to get through all the questions coming in. So Andrew, maybe this one's for you, I think. Given the supply chain issues we continue to see in batteries, critical minerals, and the EV supply, how are manufacturers responding? Are they limiting their material inputs to reduce how much they need? And are there any metals or minerals for batteries that are at low or critical levels? And if we don't take them into account, if we don't secure more supply, they're going to be the limiting factor. Just a few questions like on that theme.
Yeah, I think it'd be nice. I think a lot of the automakers at the moment would especially like to just reduce the amount they need. Unfortunately, the development of battery technology has sort of dictated that while there will be improvements in how much you maybe need to get that same amount of energy storage, it's not going to move the needle in the short term. And the growth trajectory of the market fundamentally dictates that you're just going to need more raw materials. So, we certainly see the most critical raw materials in the supply chain as, number one being lithium, as the name would suggest. Lithium's used across all of these different technologies, so it's your staple. So lithium, and you're already seeing at the moment with some of the record high prices in the market, are indicative of the shortages that are already occurring in the lithium sector today. And then I think over particularly the next decade, you're just going to see various parts of this supply chain really stretched, particularly if you look at the raw materials that aren't necessarily starting from a very established base. Lithium a couple of years ago was, less than 300,000 tons a year was being produced. Cobalt's, around 100,000 tons. We're not talking about big bulk commodities that can sort of be, ramped up and be relatively responsive to your demands. So I think cobalt, is going to be strategic, even though companies would like to phase that out through technology developments. Ultimately, you're going to need some part of cobalt for a lot of your Western passenger EVs that are being targeted. Nickel, of course, if you're not using a cobalt, you're using a higher intensity of nickel. So if you do shift away from cobalt, you have the added difficulty that you're just going to need that bit more nickel. And then, even through to the anode side, you talk about some of your anode raw materials, your graphites, which people see as more abundant. Yes, they are maybe geologically pretty abundant, but I think the key is for all of these raw materials is not necessarily how much supply you can get just from the extraction. It's about how do you refine those to what the battery industry can ultimately use. So that's your chemicals, your more chemical step in this supply chain. So yeah, as I say, that's just a few of the areas that are going to face challenges. I think lithium is the perfect case study and maybe shows us the direction we're going in some of these other markets, but there's a lot of components that go into batteries, and those markets are really going to have to respond in a short amount of time.
Great, thanks. Okay, Ilka, in 1 minute, the assumption is in a battery strategy. New question. The assumption in a battery strategy, it seems to be that while the government plays a vital coordinating role, the private sector must ultimately lead on investment and production. Is there room, or is there a need for governments to take a more direct role in the battery supply chain, especially if the private sector is moving too slowly?
In many cases, what we have seen, the industry has in fact been moving much faster than the public interventions. At least in Europe, this was the case. What we've seen with a lot of the regulatory framework that was a support for the industry and really gives the insurance for the industries to come with all the investments needed. I think this was a good way it has worked so far, without the government dictating exactly where to invest, in what to invest as well. And maybe getting back also to Andrew's question, I think this is another opportunity that we unfortunately have not talked about, but looking also not only at the immediate current demand, but also looking around what is coming. And there's ample opportunities, I would say, to cooperate also between the EU, the US, Canada on technology and innovations to actually be able to reduce the material demand for battery technologies, looking at alternative battery chemistries, and also recycling that we haven't touched upon.
Okay, great. Well, we almost made it through all the questions. Great job, everyone. We've run out of time, so I want to invite Rachel back. Thanks for all the excellent questions from everyone in the audience, and really thanks to our guests for joining us.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much. And with that, we're bringing the webinar to a close. Andrew Miller, Leonardo Paoli, Ilka von Dalwigk, thank you so much. It was really a real pleasure having you join us. Now, for all those who've been listening in, there is an email coming with a copy of the recording and a PDF of the presentation and a short survey that will take less than 3 minutes of your time. We'd be grateful for any of your feedback about how we can improve webinars going forward. And we'd welcome you to post or share your favorite highlights from today's discussion on social media or with anyone you know who might be interested. So thank you again for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.